Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the concept of disjunction,
Okay.
and we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on disjunction.
All right.
This is kind of a dynamic resource, right?
Yes, definitely.
It's not just a normal encyclopedia.
Yeah.
It's maintained by experts, it's online, and it's freely accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty cool. For a philosopher like you, I bet this deep dive will be extra interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to delve into this.
We're not just going over the basics of disjunction. We're really exploring those areas where logic and linguistics kind of intersect.
Yeah, those gray areas, those areas where they might diverge even.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how those two perspectives come together and maybe sometimes clash.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Okay.
We'll start in a familiar territory.
Mm-hmm.
Disjunction in classical logic.
All right.
How does the Stanford Encyclopedia define it?
Well, in classical logic, disjunction is all about truth values.
Yeah.
It's represented by the symbol hes, and it's a truth function. Meaning, the truth of a disjunction hinges solely on the truth of its individual parts, called disjuncts. So a disjunction is true if at least one of its disjuncts is true.
So the sky is blue or the grass is green is true because at least one part is definitely true,
Exactly.
even though the other is true too.
That's right. Even if both are true, the disjunction holds as long as at least one is true.
Okay, and I think classical logic uses two main rules for manipulating disjunctions in proofs, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's disjunction introduction and disjunction elimination.
Okay, what is disjunction introduction?
So disjunction introduction states that if we know a statement A is true, we can create a disjunction A or B, even if B is complete nonsense.
So even if pigs can fly is demonstrably false, cats are mammals or pigs can fly is still a valid statement.
Yes, exactly. That might seem odd, but that's the power of disjunction introduction.
It does seem a bit counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But it's a fundamental rule in classical logic.
Okay, and then what about disjunction elimination?
Well, disjunction elimination states that if we have a true disjunction, A or B, and we can derive the same conclusion C from both A and B individually, then C must be true.
Okay, so that's kind of like a proof by cases approach.
Yeah, exactly. You consider both possibilities, and if they lead to the same conclusion, then that conclusion must hold.
Okay, and the source mentions validity as a really key concept in classical logic.
Right.
What are the different ways that validity is determined?
So validity in classical logic has two sides, two facets, if you will.
Okay.
There's proof theoretical validity and model theoretical validity.
Okay, so proof theoretical validity.
It means that a conclusion is valid if it can be derived from the premises through a formal proof. It's like following a set of rules to arrive at a conclusion.
Makes sense. And then model theoretical.
Model theoretical validity means there's no possible scenario or model where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false.
Okay, so if it's true in all possible worlds, basically.
Exactly. And what's really neat about classical logic is that both types of validity are actually equivalent. So if an argument is valid in one sense, it's also valid in the other.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it shows a kind of robustness of classical logic.
So classical logic's pretty airtight. Now, one of the principles I think that classical logic validates is, and you're probably familiar with this, it's the law of excluded middle.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
The law of excluded middle essentially asserts that for any given statement, either that statement is true or its negation is true. There's no in between.
Okay, so either you're wearing a blue shirt or you're not.
Exactly. There's no middle ground.
It seems pretty straightforward. But I'm guessing that's where things start to get a bit more complex.
Yeah, you're on the right track there. While the law of excluded middle seems intuitive on the surface, it turns out that it and classical logic's interpretation of disjunction more broadly have sparked a lot of debate among philosophers and logicians.
Here's where things get really interesting. What are some of those challenges to classical logic's view of disjunction?
Well, one of the most prominent challenges comes from intuitionistic logic.
Okay.
And intuitionistic logic actually rejects the universal applicability of the law of excluded middle.
It does, wow.
They do. They use this thing called the BHK interpretation, which shifts the focus from abstract truth to provability.
Okay.
So for intuitionists, a statement's meaning is tied to whether we can construct a proof for it.
So it's not just about whether it's abstractly true or false, but whether we can actually demonstrate it. one way or the other.
Exactly. It's a shift from truth to proof.
That's a pretty significant shift.
It is. It has some pretty deep implications. Think about unsolved mathematical problems, for example.
Okay.
We don't have proofs for them or their negations, right?
Right.
So intuitionistic logic would say, well, the law of excluded middle doesn't hold here. We can't definitively say either the statement or its negation is true because we lack that crucial proof.
This really brings up some fundamental questions about the nature of truth, right?
Exactly. It challenges this very basic assumption of bivalence that every statement must be either true or false. It might not always be so clear-cut.
So bivalence, the idea that every statement's either true or false, that's not always so simple.
It's not always black and white. And questioning bivalence leads us to a fascinating area, multi-valued logics.
Multi-valued logic. That sounds like that sounds really complicated.
It's actually a very intriguing concept. It's about acknowledging that reality doesn't always fit into neat true or false categories.
What?
Multi-valued logics introduce additional truth values to deal with things like uncertainty, vagueness, or even paradoxes.
Okay, so instead of just true and false, you might have true, false, and maybe something like undetermined or unknown.
That's the idea. It's like adding shades of gray to that black and white picture of classical logic.
A much more nuanced way of looking at truth.
Exactly. And it allows for a more flexible approach to logic that can better accommodate the complexities of our world.
Can you give us some examples of those multi-valued systems?
Sure. There are quite a few. Yukasevich, for instance, developed a three-valued logic with true, false, and possible.
Yeah.
And Kleen's strong three-valued logic uses true, false, and undefined. There's even Priest's logic of paradox, which allows for statements to be both true and false.
Wait, both true and false. That almost seems like cheating.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it illustrates that there are different ways of approaching truth, especially when dealing with those tricky paradoxes and contradictions.
Right. It's like bending the rules a bit to account for those edge cases where classical logic struggles.
That's one way to put it. And it highlights the limitations of a strictly bivalent system.
Can you give me an example of a case where a classical logic might struggle?
Certainly. Take the classic philosophical puzzle. The King of France is bald.
Oh, yeah.
This statement seems to presuppose that there is a King of France, which, of course, isn't true today. So is the statement true or false?
Yeah, it's a bit of a head-scratcher.
It is. And multi-valued logics try to accommodate situations like this where the truth value isn't so clear-cut.
They offer a way to deal with those tricky presuppositions, those hidden assumptions embedded in statements that can really challenge the idea of binary truth.
Exactly. They provide a more flexible framework for evaluating truth in those cases.
What are some other frameworks that challenge that idea of bivalence?
Well, dynamic semantics is another interesting one. Instead of focusing on truth in isolation, dynamic semantics examines how sentences change the context of a conversation.
Okay, so it's not just about analyzing the sentence on its own, but about how it fits into the bigger picture of a conversation, how it updates information.
Exactly. It's about the flow of information and how meaning is built up over the course of a conversation.
Can you give us an example of how this works?
Sure. The bathroom example is a classic. Either there's no bathroom in the house or it's in a funny place.
Yeah.
Notice how the second part of the sentence refers back to no bathroom, even though grammatically it shouldn't.
Right. It's like there's an implied connection there.
Exactly. And dynamic semantics helps us understand how language works in these situations where the meaning of a sentence relies on the context created by what's been said before.
That's really insightful. So dynamic semantics focuses on how each part of a sentence can shift the informational landscape of a conversation. What about supervaluationism? How does that fit into all of this?
Supervaluationism takes a different approach. Imagine we have a bunch of classical valuations, which, just assign true or false to statements.
Right.
Supervaluationism looks for agreement between these valuations. If they all agree a statement is true, then it's considered super true. If they all agree it's false, it's super false. But if there's disagreement, the statement falls into a truth value gap. It's kind of like a voting system among different ways of assigning truth values.
Right. If there's no clear consensus, then we end up in this state of uncertainty.
Exactly.
So we've got intuitionistic logic, multi-valued logics, dynamic semantics, and supervaluationism, all challenging the classical view of disjunction and truth. And I think there's one more that's especially relevant for philosophers. Quantum logic.
Yes.
That one's particularly interesting because it steps outside of our everyday language and goes into the strange world of quantum mechanics.
Right. And it challenges not only bivalence, but also some of the fundamental laws of classical logic, like the distributive laws.
Okay, now this I've got to hear more about. Quantum logic.
Imagine applying classical logic to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle,
Yeah.
which states, that we can't know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect accuracy.
Right.
In classical logic, if A and B or C is true, then A and B or A and C must also be true.
Okay.
But quantum logic says, hold on, that doesn't always work at the subatomic level.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. Let's say A describes a particle's momentum, while B and C describe its possible positions, within certain intervals.
Okay.
Due to the uncertainty principle, A and B or C might be true. We know the momentum and that the particle is in one of those positions, but both A and B and A and C could be false because we can't pinpoint both the momentum and the exact position at the same time.
So it's like, you can know one or the other, but not both.
Exactly. And that clashes with the distributive law in classical logic.
That's quite a mind bender.
It is. It challenges some very fundamental assumptions we have about logic.
So quantum logic really throws a wrench into some of our basic assumptions about logic. It seems that even logic needs to adapt to different levels of reality.
Indeed. And it really highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to truth and logical reasoning. The best approach often depends on the context and the types of questions we're asking. Welcome back to our deep dive into disjunction. Before we jump into how or functions in natural language, let's touch on a couple more concepts closely tied to disjunction in classical logic: disjunctive syllogism and addition.
Okay, those sound intriguing. What are they all about?
Well, disjunctive syllogism basically says that if we know a disjunction A or B is true, and we also know A is false, we can conclude that B must be true, like a process of elimination.
So if I know it's raining or it's sunny, and I look outside and it's definitely not raining, then it must be sunny, right?
Exactly. It's a pretty intuitive concept.
Yeah, it feels very natural.
Now, addition is a bit simpler. If A is true, then we can conclude A or B is also true, regardless of whether B is true or false.
So if I know trees produce oxygen is true, I can say trees produce oxygen or the moon is made of cheese, even though the second part is obviously false.
Precisely. That's addition in action. However, like many principles in logic, disjunctive syllogism has faced some criticism. Relevantists, in particular, have raised some interesting objections.
Relevantists. I'm not familiar with that perspective. What's their main critique?
Relevantists argue that logical inferences should be more than just truth-preserving. They believe there should be a real connection, a relevance between the premises and the conclusion.
I see. So truth without relevance is a bit hollow.
Exactly. They point to disjunctive syllogism as a potential offender, often using a story about the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus and his dog to illustrate their point.
Oh, okay. A philosophical dog story. I'm all ears.
So the story goes that Chrysippus's dog, when faced with a three-way fork in the road, sniffed two paths where its prey hadn't gone. Then, without sniffing the third path, the dog ran down it. Relevantists argue that the dog didn't actually use disjunctive syllogism to choose its path.
Wait, why not? It seems like that's exactly what the dog did, eliminating two possibilities to arrive at the third.
Well, the relevantist would say the dog's decision wasn't based on logical deduction, but rather on instinct and experience.
Okay.
They believe that the or in disjunctive syllogism should imply a genuine connection between the disjuncts, not just this truth-functional relationship.
So it's not just about the truth value of one being true, but whether the or implies a kind of meaningful relationship between the options.
Exactly. That's the crux of their argument.
Interesting. That is a subtle but important distinction.
It is. And this distinction leads us to what Anderson and Belknap called intentional and extensional disjunction. Intentional disjunction requires that strong, relevant connection between the disjuncts, while extensional disjunction focuses solely on truth values.
Okay, I think I'm following you so far. Can you give me some real-world examples to illustrate the difference?
Absolutely. Consider the statement: that creature is either Drosophila melanogaster or D. virilis. This implies a tight connection between the disjuncts,
Okay.
right? Both being species of fruit fly. If it's not one, it must be the other. This would be intentional disjunction.
Okay, so the or there feels very focused, very specific. What about an example of extensional disjunction?
Consider this: Napoleon was born in Corsica, or the number of the beast is perfect. These disjuncts seem utterly unrelated, lacking any meaningful connection. This would be extensional disjunction, where the or simply connects two truth values without any deeper relevance.
Those examples really highlight the difference. It seems like this debate about relevance and disjunction is asking some fundamental questions about how we use or in language and reasoning.
Exactly. And that brings us to the fascinating intersection of logic and language. So far, we've been mostly in the realm of formal logic. But when we look at how or functions in natural language, things become even more nuanced.
That's what I love about these deep dives, peeling back those layers to reveal the hidden complexities. What are some of the key differences between that logical disjunction and disjunction in natural language?
One key difference is that logical disjunction is strictly binary. It connects only two elements. Natural language, on the other hand, allows us to connect an unlimited number of disjuncts using or.
Right. We can say things like, for dinner, I could go for pizza, or tacos, or sushi, or maybe even just a salad.
Exactly. We're not limited to just two options like in formal logic.
Right. And another difference, I think, is that logical disjunction is strictly sentential, right?
Yeah.
It connects sentences or propositions. But natural language disjunction can be cross-categorial. It can connect phrases of different types.
Absolutely. It's much more flexible. So we can say, the winner is either John or Mary, connecting two noun phrases. Or she's talented at singing or playing the piano, connecting verb phrases. That flexibility seems essential for natural language to work the way it does.
Yeah, definitely. So how do we account for this flexibility?
Well, Keenan and Fultz proposed a pretty elegant solution. They analyzed or as the join operator in a Boolean algebra, which is a fancy way of describing set union.
Okay, so now we're talking about sets. I'm trying to keep up.
Think of it this way. John refers to the set of all John's properties, and Mary refers to the set of all Mary's properties. John or Mary then refers to the combined set of properties belonging to either John or Mary.
So it's like we're merging the possibilities represented by each disjunct.
Exactly. It's a powerful way to represent how or can combine different categories of language.
That makes sense. But the source also mentioned a challenge to this approach, something about wide-scope or in opaque contexts. Can you explain that?
Yes, you're right. Ruth and Partier pointed out that sometimes or seems to have a broader scope than this set union analysis can handle. Their famous example is the sentence, Mary is looking for a maid or a cook.
At first glance, it seems straightforward. Mary's looking for someone who could be either, right? What's the issue there?
Well, there's another interpretation where Mary is either looking specifically for a maid or specifically for a cook, but we don't know which. This wide scope interpretation isn't easily captured by that standard set union approach.
I see. So the disjunction is influencing the entire meaning of the sentence, not just the specific phrases it connects.
Exactly. It's like there's an unspoken either hanging over the whole sentence. It's a fascinating puzzle, and Ruth and Partee proposed a dynamic analysis to account for these cases. But there's still ongoing debate about the best way to represent this wide-scope phenomenon.
This is making me appreciate how subtle this little word or can be. It seems so simple on the surface.
It does, doesn't it? But there's so much going on beneath the surface. We've seen the logical side, the linguistic side, but how does it all play out in actual conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. It brings us to the realm of pragmatics, where we consider how language is used in context.
Right, and Grace's theory of conversational implicatures offers a compelling explanation for how or functions in everyday conversations.
Ah, Grice. He's famous for his maxims of conversation. Quality, quantity, relation, and manner.
You got it. And Grace argues that we shouldn't overcomplicate the meaning of or itself. Instead, those extra inferences we draw from disjunctive statements, the ones that go beyond those literal truth conditions, they arise from our adherence to those conversational norms.
So it's not that or has some hidden complex meaning, but that we use it in ways that convey more than just its basic truth function.
Exactly. We read between the lines, as we often do in conversations.
Right. Can you give an example?
Sure. If I tell you Mary is either at the library or at the cafe, you might naturally conclude that I don't know for sure which one is true and that Mary isn't at both places. Grice would say these conclusions, ignorance and exclusivity inferences, aren't part of the literal meaning of or.
But they feel so natural. If you knew where she was, you'd have just said so.
Precisely. We assume speakers are being informative and truthful. So by using or, you infer that I'm unsure of Mary's exact location and that she's likely only at one of those places.
It's fascinating how much we can infer from such a simple word. So Grice is arguing that these additional layers of meaning are pragmatic. stemming from how we use language in social contexts rather than being hardwired into the meaning of or.
Exactly. But of course, language is full of surprises. There are cases where or seems to behave in ways that challenge even Grice's pragmatic account. For instance, some languages have special disjunctive constructions that strongly favor those exclusive interpretations.
So they emphasize that only one of the options can be true.
Exactly. Think about phrases like either.or in English, soit in French, or vaji in Hungarian. These constructions often seem to force an exclusive reading, even in situations where a plain or wouldn't necessarily do so.
So the structure of the sentence itself is nudging us towards a specific interpretation of the disjunction. Can you give an example?
Sure, let's compare two French sentences. Marie ira au cinéma lundi ou mardi. Marie will go to the cinema on Monday or Tuesday. This allows for the possibility that Marie goes on both days, but Marie ira au cinéma soit lundi soit mardi. Marie will go to the cinema either on Monday or on Tuesday. Strongly suggests she'll go on only one of those days. That soit makes a big difference.
Wow, that's fascinating. Even though Grice argued against a fundamental ambiguity in or, there seem to be cases where exclusivity is more deeply embedded in the language itself.
You got it. Linguists like Cebolci and Spector have delved into this, arguing that these constructions obligatorily trigger that exclusivity inference, unlike plain or, which often leaves it optional.
So it seems like it's not always so clear-cut, that there's this interesting interplay between the semantics of disjunction and our pragmatic understanding of conversations.
Exactly. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to or.
Absolutely. This is really making me rethink how much we take for granted when we use these seemingly simple words.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, isn't it? The more we look, the more complexity we find.
I'm eager to see what other insights await us. The source also mentioned modal accounts of disjunction and something called free choice. Could we dive into that next?
Absolutely. Modal logic and the concept of free choice offer a fascinating lens through which to examine disjunction. They bring us into the realm of possibility and permission, which adds a whole new layer of complexity to our discussion.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into disjunction. We've covered a lot of ground, from classical logic to the nuances of or in natural language, and now we're stepping into the realm of modality.
Yes.
To explore how disjunction interacts with these concepts like possibility and permission.
Modality adds a whole new dimension to our understanding of disjunction.
Okay.
Think about it as like, you may have coffee or tea.
Yeah.
We intuitively interpret this as offering a choice, right? You're permitted to have either one.
Right. It's like a 2-for-1 permission slip.
Exactly. But I have a feeling it's not quite as simple as it seems.
Is that interpretation actually baked into the meaning of or is there something else going on?
That's a great question, and it gets at what's known as the paradox of free choice permissions. In standard deontic logic, which deals with obligations and permissions, the inference from you may A or B to you may A and you may B isn't actually valid.
Wait, really? That seems so counterintuitive. If I'm allowed to have coffee or tea, shouldn't I be allowed to have either one individually?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But that's the paradox. It highlights a tension between our intuitive understanding of disjunction and the formal systems we use to represent it.
So how do we resolve this paradox? Does logic need a major overhaul to align with our intuitions about permission and choice?
Well, there are a few different approaches. Some philosophers and linguists argue that free choice inference is a pragmatic one.
Okay.
It arises from the context of the conversation rather than being like a core logical entailment.
So it's not about the literal meaning of the words, but understanding the speaker's intentions and the conversational context.
Exactly. If someone says you may have coffee or tea, we assume they're being cooperative. They're offering a genuine choice, not just stating a dry fact about what's permitted.
Right. It's more about what's implied than what's explicitly stated. But what about those who want to stick with a more formal, logic-based approach? How do they address this paradox?
Well, some have proposed modifying our logical systems to accommodate free choice. One approach is to treat or in these contexts as having a wider scope.
Okay.
It's as though we're saying, you may have coffee or you may have tea.
Right. So by restructuring the sentence, we're making the disjunction more prominent, highlighting the idea of separate permissions.
Exactly. It makes the choice aspect more explicit. And another way to capture that sense of choice within a formal system is to use modality.
Okay.
Zimmerman, for instance, developed a modal analysis of disjunction, arguing that or inherently conveys a sense of epistemic possibility. It expresses that the speaker considers each disjunct to be a genuine option.
So you may have coffee or tea becomes something like, it's possible that you may have coffee and it's possible that you may have tea.
Precisely. This modal interpretation nicely captures that open-ended nature of disjunction, reflecting how we use it to explore and present options.
It's a much more nuanced way of looking at or than simply as a truth function.
Exactly. And it also helps to explain why we don't get free choice inferences in those negative contexts. You may not have coffee or tea doesn't imply you're forbidden from having both, because it's not about presenting options, but about setting restrictions.
Right. The focus shifts from possibility to prohibition. Now, the source also mentions something called alternative-based accounts. What can you tell us about those?
Alternative-based accounts offer a different perspective on disjunction. Instead of focusing on truth values alone, they emphasize the presentation of alternatives.
Okay.
The idea is that the core meaning of a disjunction isn't just about whether it's true or false, but about presenting a set of possibilities for consideration.
So instead of asking, is this disjunction true, we're asking, what are the possibilities it brings to the table?
Exactly. It's a shift from evaluation to exploration. A prominent example of this approach is inquisitive semantics.
Okay.
This framework evaluates sentences not just in terms of their truth in a possible world, but also in terms of how they engage with an information state.
Information state.
It represents the knowledge and uncertainties of a conversational participant. So it's about how a sentence contributes to what we know and don't know in a given context.
So it's not just about the truth of a sentence, but about how it affects our understanding of the situation.
Exactly. In inquisitive semantics, A or B is supported by an information state if that state allows for the possibility of A being true or the possibility of B being true. It's not about whether one of them is true, but whether our current knowledge leaves room for either one to be true.
That makes a lot of sense. This approach really captures that open-ended, questioning nature of disjunction, do you want coffee or tea, isn't just about whether you want one or the other, it's about presenting those options as possibilities for you to consider.
Precisely. And this perspective has implications beyond those simple questions. For example, it helps us make sense of disjunction in those counterfactual, those what-if statements.
Oh, okay. How so?
Consider this sentence. If Thorpe or Wilson were to win the next election, Britain would prosper.
Okay.
This seems to imply that if either one were to win, Britain would prosper. But a classical analysis struggles to capture this.
Why is that?
It focuses only on finding the closest possible worlds where that antecedent Thorpe or Wilson wins is true.
So there might be a world where Thorpe wins and things go badly, while in all the closest worlds where Wilson wins, things go well. A classical analysis might miss the full picture.
Exactly. But alternative-based accounts, they avoid this by treating each disjunct as a separate possibility to be considered, allowing us to explore the consequences of each scenario individually.
It's like branching out into different hypothetical scenarios, instead of just looking for the most likely one. That's much more in line with how we think about those counterfactuals. What other puzzles does this approach help to solve?
Another great example is how it clarifies the ambiguity of disjunctive questions. Do you want coffee or tea? Can be a yes-no question, but it can also be a question about which one you prefer.
Right.
Inquisitive semantics represents this ambiguity by distinguishing between the basic alternative meaning of disjunction and a closed version that yields a yes-no question.
So we could zoom in on the individual alternatives or zoom out to consider the broader question of whether any of the options are desired.
Exactly. It's a very elegant way to capture that ambiguity. And what's even more fascinating is that some languages have different words for those two types of disjunction. Basque, for example, has one word specifically for questions and another for more general uses of or.
It's amazing how different languages can carve up these conceptual spaces in unique ways. This has been an incredible journey. We've gone from the foundations of classical logic to the complexities of modality and alternative-based systems, all through the lens of this seemingly simple word, or.
It really shows the depth and richness of language and logic. Even the most basic logical concepts like or can reveal such hidden depths when we examine how they function in the real world.
I definitely have a whole new appreciation for the power and the puzzles of disjunction. What's the key takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with from our deep dive?
For me, the most important takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding disjunction. There are many different ways to interpret and analyze it, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The best approach often depends on the specific context, the questions we're asking, and the goals of our analysis.
That's a great point. It's not about finding the right answer, but about choosing the right tool for the job, whether we're working with formal logic, natural language, or exploring the philosophical implications of these concepts.
Absolutely. And I hope our deep dive has encouraged listeners to think critically about these different approaches and to keep exploring this fascinating world of disjunction.
I know I'll never look at or the same way again. For listeners who want to delve deeper, we highly recommend checking out that full disjunction entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a treasure trove of information.
It really is. And remember, as with any philosophical concept, the journey of understanding is just as important as the destination.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy philosophizing.